When his friends told him the truth, it was like the bottom fell out of his world. In an instant, he went from looking forward to a bright future to not being sure about anything. All his life, he had been lied to, and for what? So that he could protect his father? Now, all of the lies were about to fall like a house of cards. So, what did he do? The night before his graduation, Steve Lichtig felt as though he had his whole life ahead of him. With only a few weeks left before he left his quiet Kansas town to join the Marines, he spent as much time as possible with his friends and family. But his friends waited until the very end before they decided it was time to tell the truth. It was such a terrible secret that everyone in town knew about it. Except Steve, everyone knew. Steve was one of 8 children. Even though Steve was a lot younger than his older sister Joni, he never gave it much thought. He knew that Mary and Don Lichtig wanted another son because they told him so. He never thought to ask them any questions. After all, he thought that the people who raised him were the only ones he could trust to tell him the truth. But how far would they go to protect the people who were involved? Mary and Don did everything they could to keep Steve from finding out what had happened, and they were mostly successful. But he had a strange sense that something wasn't quite right his whole life. When he was a teenager, he thought that his feeling of unease was just normal teenage angst. Despite his best efforts, he was unable to shake the uneasy sensation he had been experiencing. There was a discrepancy in the reasoning. In the meantime, everyone in the small town knew. Steve's friends, siblings, classmates, teachers, and even the girl he dated in high school all knew who his real father was. He was always the subject of whispers and rumors, but the dirty secret stayed locked away behind closed doors. For 18 years, nobody knew about the Lichtig scandal. Mary and Don did their best to keep him from finding out the truth. But, like all secrets, it got out in the end. Steve wasn't ready to hear it, though. Steve didn't know his family had a dark secret until the day before he graduated from high school. He was hanging out with his 2 best friends, Vance and Alan, when they decided it was time to stop lying. Even though their parents had told them to keep quiet, they knew it was time to tell. Who else would tell Steve the ugly truth if they didn't? Time for him to find out what his father did all those years ago. Vance looked at Alan and tried to be careful about how he approached the subject. He had given a lot of thought to how the bombshell he was about to drop on Steve would make him feel. He knew that Steve's parents would never tell him the truth and that they would be ashamed if the family name was ruined. But Steve was soon going to join the Marines. They had one last chance. "Steve, we want to tell you something," he said in a quiet voice. At first, Steve didn't really understand what his friend was trying to say. Alan looked at Vance, but he shook his head and said, "No, he needs to know." "What needed to be known?" Vance continued. "Your sister, Joni." Well, as Vance told him everything, Steve felt like the world he knew broke into a million pieces. He couldn't be stopped anymore. "I was just quiet, and they said what they knew to fill the silence. They told me who my mother was and said they had known her for almost their whole lives," Steve says. "And that everyone I grew up with had known for their whole lives, and they thought this was the time I needed to know." However, whose son Steve was? Vance told Steve that his sister Joni was in fact his real mother. Steve listened, dumbstruck. If Joni was his mother, who had he been calling his parents for the past 18 years? After this, he didn't even know who he was, let alone what it all meant. But when Vance was done, he only had one question for him. "Who knows else?" Steve asked, his eyes wide. Alan said in a soft voice, "Everyone." Steve couldn't believe that everyone in the town had been lying to him. He felt betrayed, and then that hurt turned into anger. His real father had left him alone. His whole life, including who he was and what he knew, vanished in a puff of smoke, revealing an ugly secret. He could do nothing else. Steve kept the secret from his parents for another 6 weeks before he told them. They went to his graduation with big smiles on their faces, and Steve went along with it. But the whole thing was a joke. Steve remembers, "When I found out, I didn't tell anyone. It was the middle of May 1987. The next night was my high school graduation. I went to it, spoke at it, went to all the parties, and did everything. However, the detonation of the time bomb was merely a question of when it would take place." Steve said, "I kept it to myself for another month and a half, and then I told my parents and grandparents about it. Then, because I was 18 and mad, I ran away. I got in a car and drove 20 miles to the closest town, where I rented a room with my friends. The doorbell rang all of a sudden. When Steve opened the door, Joni was standing there. He had always thought of her as his older sister. She had found him to tell him the truth. There was a moment when we said, 'Yes, this happened. I apologize. I mostly kept quiet,' he said. But now that the secret was out in the open, would Steve's grandparents and biological mother tell him why they had lied for so long? Steve said, part of it was that it was the early 1970s, and part of it was that it was a small town with a close-knit community. Those in the neighborhood who knew but kept quiet were just trying to be good neighbors. Joni got pregnant without being married, so her parents decided to raise Steve as their own to protect the family name. But this is not as strange as you might think. Donnie Shapiro interviewed Steve for her podcast Family Secrets. She says that more and more people are finding out their true ancestry these days, especially since home DNA kits are becoming more popular. She even used the word epidemic to describe it. But is it right for a family to hide so much about who their members are? Donnie told Today, in the end, people do have a right to know, and I think they also feel free when they know the truth. Those who keep secrets are carrying a heavy load. The question is not so much if they should share the secret, but when. Was Steve ready to face his own truth after he found out what it was? Steve joined the Marines soon after he learned that his sister was his real mother. After he did his time, he got married and set down roots. He got a good job as a reporter at NBC News, but his relationship didn't work out, and the two of them got a divorce. Joni, Don, and Mary Jane never brought up his real family tree again, not until 15 years later. In 2013, Steve decided to make a documentary called Open Secret about what he had been through. In the film, he talks to his grandparents, childhood friends, and siblings to try to find out more about a subject that has been so cloudy for him all his life. He had to go on a trip of self-discovery to try to fill in the blanks. Steve tells KRWG in an interview how that earth-shattering news changed him for good. After that day, nobody talked about it again until 15 years later, he said. We didn't talk about it, that's all. Even though it sounds dramatic, I changed that day. Now that the family secret was out in the open, it had hurt Steve's relationship with his family. In high school, I was a really happy-go-lucky guy, but something shut down in me, and the relationship kind of just ended, he said. It was just a must, and everyone in the family felt the same way. You should know that I have a big family. I have 2 brothers and 6 sisters. I thought they were all in on it, so I just went my own way. But could the Lichtigs get along again? Steve tried to picture what his mother must have felt. She had to live a lie after giving up her child. I was trying to figure out what it must have been like to have a baby and then have your own parents take the baby and tell you that the story is going to be that you're this baby's sister and not his real mother, and you have to live with that for pretty much the rest of your life. But did Joni really want to let him go? She says she didn't want to give me up. My parents say that's not true and that she needed the help. I think it's somewhere in the middle, like most things, Steve said. And I think she was told that this is the story. If we go down this road, this is the story we'll use, and you'll have to stick to it. And that's when everyone in the family found out. But how would they feel about the movie? Steve's biological grandparents, Don and Mary Jane, seemed happy to finally talk about the truth, but Steve's mother, Joni, wasn't ready to sit down and talk about the details. She got married and now has more kids. Steve had no choice but to feel sad. She didn't want anything to do with his search for herself or his documentary about it. She just told me, I watched your movie. I know why you did it, Steve told him. I don't want to have anything to do with it in the future, so don't ask me to do anything about it. We've sent each other a few emails, but we haven't talked in a long time, which is not what I had hoped for. But there is a bright side. Steve felt like a weight had been taken off his shoulders after filming. I got to talk to these people. The movie gave me and them the green light to talk about things we wouldn't have talked about otherwise. So, yes, I can say that, in the end, this did what it was supposed to do. Steve is happily married, and he hopes to have his own kids someday. Now that he was okay with what had happened, he wanted to know something else. Someone had to ask Joni how involved she wants to be. Steve was wondering if his kids will call her their grandmother or their aunt. Joni smiled and said, Joni. She looked excited. Just Joni.